am Chala. And I'm also practice as an interior designer, and I did quite a lot of installation as well under my studio under Gogi. And for today's lecture, I'll be sharing about towards a new narrative. So this is based on my personal view from my own observations, based on research that I did under the academics practice, and also my perspective towards my own observation towards the experience that I did throughout these years practicing as an interior designer. So I'll be talking about my personal definitions of narrative and what is the benefit of narrative to be embedded in your interior design project, so interior design practice. And I'll be showing some of the examples of works. So I hope you can understand my version of narratives for your project. So okay, so for me, a narrative is actually a discovering procedure for an interior design project. Just 1 second, I think my screen, I cannot see my screen now. Okay, just 1 sec. Sorry, I'm not very familiar with Zoom, so I'm just gonna minimize some of this pop-up thing appear on my screen. Just 1 second. Sorry, yeah. Okay. You can see my screen now, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, right. So to continue, for me, narrative is more about storytelling. It's actually a discovering procedure for the interior architectural design project. So narratives are one of the most natural ways for people to exchange information because they evoke more meaning and emotion than bare facts. It conveys information, especially for designers and researchers, to communicate insights more clearly using personal stories, such as our belief, our theory, our opinions, suggestions, and philosophy, and so on. So narrative is not a literal representation of what something that is physical, but rather what it means to be. So I believe narratives is more on its content that relate to our emotions and our sense of humor, rather than just a design that is just practical. So the ability of narrative to communicate ideas and to stimulate imaginations allow designs to be beyond functional, and it opens a new perspective to imagine and discuss and propose scenarios for the future, as in design fictions or in critical design. So having a narrative in your design projects actually gives it actually navigate your project to be more critical. So I'm sure you heard this a lot, that we at design is actually have been everything have been designed actually. So what we are doing right now is more on manipulation of design. So, but what makes one design different from another is its content, the narrative behind every project that you did. So that will create the originality in your project. So having a narrative also navigate you to think critical in the design process, because you go beyond the imaginations, you go beyond things that is common, and that is what makes your project become unique and different from each other, even though the type of project is similar. So having a narrative is also adding a soul to your project. So this is, I think, 4 of the items that what narrative can do to your project. So there are 3 main aspects in creating a narrative for the interior architecture studies based on my observations. and based on my research that I did in UiTM. So for me, these are the three main aspects that need to be tackled for designers and students in having your own narrative, and that is theory, realism, and reasoning. So theory is technically the conceptual approach. I believe all of you, when you creating your own project, you always start with the concept. So that is the theory. Technically, all these concepts and theory were based on your hypothesis, a metaphor, your philosophy, your beliefs, and your postulations. But the theory cannot be on its own in interior architecture studies, because as an interior designer, your job is actually to create a practical experience for your user. So you need to add the realism elements in your projects. And that realism elements is actually a realistic and a technical approach, often supported by research and assessing what works and what does not. So you have to add the accuracy, the practicality, the functionality, validity, durability in your project. And most of interior design project, you have to be adaptive to the site context and its people and its community. So of course, when you doing your project, having a narrative will create a reasoning to your project. You know, what is the intention of your project? You know, what issue are you solving? Are you creating any positive changes to the community? Are you bringing any positive awareness to the people? So in narrative, you need to have all these three aspects, or else your project would be dull. There is no intention in your project, there's no originality, and there is no critical design process in the design process. So I found this quote by Robert Huddart, which he said that every design is a hypothesis and a practical experience. And I couldn't agree more. So especially in interior design project, right? I think we cannot rely only on the concept, but we also need to add on the practical experience. The hypothesis is the theory, and the practical experience is the realism. So the theory, concept, and so on is the one that guide you to create your own design aesthetic or design concept. To find the mood board of your project, the look and feel, and to guide you to choose your materials. You know, what type of material selection that you can add based on that concept. And of course, your theory or concept cannot stand alone. You have to add on with realism. And that realism is actually to support the practical experience for your user. Of course, it has to be ergonomic. Your space planning have to be practical, durability, and of course, functional. So thankfully, these are the three main aspects that I believe it's very important in creating your own narratives. First is the theory to get your aesthetic and originality of your project. And then realism. This is a realistic and technical approach based on accuracy, practicality, functionality, and validity. The realism actually assessing what's work and what does not. And of course, reasoning is what is your project, what is the objective of your project. So you need to have that in creating your own narratives. So since narrative is more like a storytelling, you know, I always find that there are similarities in interior design and also films. Based on my research in my academics industry, I find that films also use these three aspects in making their films, which is using theory, realism, and reasoning. So in films or movies, I'm sure a lot of you love watching movies. Especially in science fiction movies like Avatar, Blade Runner, I'm sure a lot of you watch quite a lot of science fiction movies. In creating that movies, the filmmakers need to have a theory to start with. The theory is actually to generate the plot, the story about behind a plot that will based on a theory or belief or assumptions, metaphor, and a philosophy. And the theory is actually what makes the film or the movie is different from other movies. That what makes the film is unique and uncommon. But it cannot, the theory itself cannot stand on its own. They have to create, to apply the elements of realism in that movie, so that the film can actually persuade people to believe in that theory, to make people believe that that is realistic and that is real. So, for example, in a lot of scenes, especially in interior scenes in films or in movies, they have to make the space functional, practical, and suitable to its site context. And of course, it's suitable with the people's culture and practice. So they need to have that realism to make people believe to that story. And then by the end of the films or movie, there's always a message to tell to the viewers. What are the messages that the film trying to say, and what is it that people can learn from this story? So I find it quite similar to an interior design project, especially during your time in school, where of course we also need theory, realism, and reasoning as well. So theory is actually a conceptual approach where we generate our concept based on mechanism, theory, subject matter, based on our opinion and assumptions, to create our project totally different from other people, even though the brief is the same. So, and throughout the project, you also need to include the realism, the elements of realism in interior design project, so that the space become functional, the space become practical, because you have to think that um, the main role for designer is to make people comfortable in that habitable space. So it's the same as films, where by the end of the day, when you present your project, people will ask, what is the objective of this project? What are the issues that you are tackling? Are you solving any issues? Are you giving a positive changes to the community? Are you putting some sustainability in there? So what are your intention and what is the objective? So I believe there are a lot of comments between producing a films and also interior design. I always ask my students to, watch films and observe and think about how you can embed it, that characteristic or elements in your interior design projects. So I would like to share some of the film which I think will make you understand more about narrative. This is a movie called Ghost in the Shell. The original one is actually an anime, manga anime. Is produced in 1995, if I'm not mistaken. So this one is reproduced by Rupert Sanders. So I'm not sure if you have watched this Ghost in the Shell, but if you haven't, you can watch it. So the reason why I took this movie is because I think the theory that they embedded is quite interesting, and how they make this theory become realistic, or make people believe to this context is quite interesting. So the Ghost in the Shell is actually about a future hypothesis, what a Hong Kong will look like in the future. So this movie portrayed a theory that is how humans are influenced by the power of computers. So by arguing that power influence might expand over time, and in this movie, they portrayed the imaginations of a future in which humans have integrated with machines. So body parts and organs are modified with weaponry and advanced functions. Eyes can be replaced by robots. Brains can be upgraded with external storage technology and so on. So this is some of the scenes from the Ghost in the Shell. And the movie is created based on how much artificial enhancements and modification can a person undergo, but remain fundamentally human. So In this movie, even though the theory is quite, is about future assumptions, um, how to make this movie to become realistic is the filmmakers actually take Hong Kong as a subject matter. So the setting is inspired by a multinational future city inspired by Hong Kong. So they have to observe and study Hong Kong and apply it as a form of realism in this story, so that people can believe to the the realistic of this story. So some of the you can look into how the movie also have some sensitivity towards the side context as well, even though the entire theory or the philosophy about this movie is talking about future cities of Hong Kong where humans are integrated with machines, but you can still see that the culture and the originality of Hong Kong are still remain. You can see a lot of elements of Hong Kong in here, even though everything have been merged with digitals and technology. You can see, the cat. Not sure what the name of the cat in the building here. So, which I think is a symbolism of luck. So all these are actually embedded into that story. So you need to have both. You need to have the elements of realism, and you also need to have the theory so that the movie looks interesting. So these are one of the scene also from the Ghost in the Shell, which I find it interesting because the first original anime Ghost in the Shell was actually produced in 1995. And I think during that time, we don't have much skyscraper. We don't have high buildings with LED screens. But that this movie actually portrayed actually a quite accurate assumption. And all these are actually based on research. Um, so you cannot just assume that thing will happen based on your own assumption. So you need to have research and facts and figures to support your theory or your idealism. So you can tell from this scene that even they actually put in their assumption or their prediction of future where the buildings are not just covered with LEDs, but also a 3D animated LED, projection where all this actually there is no more billboards or LED screens to share or to doing marketing and so on, but more on the 3D animated projection, which I find it quite interesting. Even in the movies, they also look into the characteristic of its user. In this case, the user is actually the character in this film or the cast, about what she needs, what desire, and what is practical to her. So in this case, the main character is Majamira, which is he's actually a cyborg but with a human brain. She has all these memories and sensitivity like human do, but she is confused with his characters, his personal um, characteristics. So in this movie actually portrayed, in this scene actually portrayed how she lives, because she do not eat, she do not bath. So this is how the interior would look like, designed specifically to her character. So that is actually theory and realism that is embedded in the movie Ghost in the Shell. So the next project that I would like to share is, this is not my project, this is by Joanne Chen, the project called Reimagine Factory. Joanne Chen actually graduated from Balit School of Architecture. So the reason why I share this project is because I think um, the theory that she used in this project are quite interesting and quite contra from our perspective about factory. So the project is actually a textile factory, and what she did is actually she reimagined this theory based on William Morris ideology. So if you're not familiar with William Morris, William Morris is actually a British textile designer, and this is some of his works. I believe you have seen this somewhere. So what she did is Joanne Chen took the ideology or the idealism and theories of William Morris to be embedded in her project, to navigate her to design a textile factory that is different from other factory. So the project manifests a typology of work and workspace that blurs the boundaries between work and leisure. So and this is what she created in this project. This is one of her perspectives. So the proposal is actually a factory that is beautiful, have a beautiful gardens on the riverbank of River Thames in Hammersmith, London. So it attempts to rearrange with craftsmanship whilst overlapping with contemporary technologies and to re-establish the human relationship to work, workspace and pleasure of work. This actually quite contra with the perspective that we have in mind about factory. You know, factory, if we look into the common one, is a place, is a rough place, you know, dusty, a lot of machines and machinery works and all this, components and so on. But in her project, what she did is a totally contradict where a textile factory should be, a place where we can put a pleasure to work, where the factory could become an inspirational space. So workers of craftsmanship could, to have a connection between the work that they produce and the people that produce the textile. And of course, it have to be like I said, embedded the elements of realism, where it have to be practical, ergonomics. This is one of her axonometry view, where some of the textile work space were actually outdoor. And of course, I think it's suitable with the site context in London, where it's not rainy season as Malaysia, but of course, I mean during winter time it's quite difficult. I mean, in the practicality part, I think there's a lot of things that we can question here. But what I'm trying to say is how she derived a concept based on the theory of William Morris, and that is quite. I feel like it's quite interesting. The next project that I'd like to share is my project collaborated with Studio Bikin. This is a Nico Neko Macha 1.5. The project is actually located in Bangsa. So I work with my partner Shariani Ghazali and work with Atika Idayu from Studio Bikin. So Nico Neko Macha is actually specialized in green tea and matcha green tea. And they have a lot of desserts based on green tea. This is some of the shots taken from their website. And the client wanted to extend their project, their cafe. So what he wanted is to have an installation in his site. So this project, the Niku Niku Macha, was actually based on the theory of wabi-sabi. So wabi-sabi is a Japanese philosophy concept centered on the acceptance of transience and appreciation of beauty in imperfection. So it is carried throughout many aspects of Japanese culture, from art to architecture, literature, poetry, nature, design, a Japanese garden, and one of the places it seems the most is a tea ceremony. So we thought of using the theory of wabi-sabi for Niku Niku Matcha is quite suitable since um, their main product is actually about matcha green tea. And when we're talking about matcha green tea, we always there's a lot of there's always appears in our mind about a tea ceremony. So so the whole theory about when creating this project is about imperfection, impermanence, and incomplete. So the brief from the client is actually he wanted to have an installation using paper. That is part of his agenda during the initial time in the project. And if you look into the website and Niku Niku Matcha characteristics, they always use white and quite a minimalist kind of concept in his stores. So we were thinking of what we can do from paper installation and how we can apply the wabi-sabi theory in this project. So we thought of creating, some texture or some elements to a paper installation, and we thought of putting this kind of characteristic to the installation. So this is the site in Bangsa. This is how it looks like before. Technically, it's actually next to the original Niku Niku Matcha store. So this is the extension to it. So what we the initial idea about this project is to have a paper installation at the center of this cafe. This is quite the cafe is quite small, and I think Studio Bikin have come up with a planning which is quite straightforward, and this is what we imagine the space will look like. So if you look into this project, me and Shariani think about how we can make this the centerpiece become something which highlight something that can be highlighted in this interior. And we also need to think about how we can highlight this installation, make it contrast from the spaces, but also at the same time can be adaptable to the site context. So in creating the installation, there's a lot of hands-on activity. We actually have a mock-up model during the process. Of course, we do it digitally and also hands-on physically. So we actually started off with a computerized visualizations, and then we do it on 1 to 50 scale, I think, to look at how to construct this paper and how the form would look like. So here's the model that we did in SketchUp, and next to it is our prototype. So during our presentation, we just bring our model to our client, and he liked it straight away. So this is another model that we presented during the design process. And creating it in a one-to-one scale is the hardest part because initially we thought of cutting every piece of this paper using laser cut or a CNC machine. But throughout the journey, we thought, first it's not doable because the paper is too thin, and if you use a laser cut, it will burn the paper. And also it's too big. The installation is actually about 2.5 meters, So what we did is we have to draw it by hand manually, piece by piece. We have about 80 layers of papers for that installation. And to create that imperfection concept in this paper is we tear the paper but to have that imperfection edges to the paper. So imagine we have to draw it manually, referring to our computer, the digital model that we have created, and we have to tear it out one by hand. By the end of the process, this is what it came out. You can see that there's an imperfection edges in the paper, and that is purposely we purposely do it like that because we want to maintain the theory of wabi-sabi for this project. So at the site, it's quite interesting that on the ID part is also focusing on the same thing, where we use bare concrete, and we think of how the process could be, some imperfections, characteristic could be embedded in the process. So here are some of the experimental did by the designer. This is actually the structure of a table, and you can see that it actually mimics the same ideology with the paper installation. Since wabi-sabi is about imperfections and showing something that appears that something appear like it's still in under construction, so that is part of the idea. And when the site is clear, that is when we install the paper. So we mentioned a lot of time in the discussion that the paper needs to come when the site is clear, because we don't want the paper to be ruined or dirty, because paper is very fragile. And we cannot use other materials because this is part of the brief from the client. So the client really tell us that he wants paper installation, and I believe that is actually relate to their motto or their beliefs or their characteristic about Nico Nico Macam. So this is the layers of paper that have been installed. So we actually create a frame, a steel frames on the ceiling to support the paper. Even though the materials is paper, is actually quite heavy because it's actually a watercolor paper, 250 gram. So we need to make sure that the steel frames can actually support the weight. So this is how the paper looks like when we install. And this is the final outcome. It's quite interesting to see, the entire project. Sometimes people think that a minimalist project is hard for us to have. It's hard for you to have an identity to it. So I think by having the ideology of wabi-sabi, talking about imperfections and so on, actually create the project become more interesting. Like in a way, there's a soul in it, even though everything is bare concrete and minimalist. So this is the front view of the store. You can see that there are similarities between the table structure and also the installations. And yeah, this is some of other images of the project. And this is the outcome of that paper installation that were torn by hands manually. It's quite difficult for us to have this kind of contour because we started with digital, digital 3D modeling. And then to transfer that in by hand is quite difficult, that we need to measure every layers, and we need to have every layers to code with certain number, so that during the installations we did not misplace the layers. We actually we have some difficulties in putting the paper, because everything looks the same, every layers looks the same. So, and sometimes we make a mistake sometimes, like it's actually the coding that we put on the paper is actually flipped. So actually the first one is supposed to be the last one. So we have to reopen and reinstall, reassemble and install again. But I believe is the process is quite interesting. And I think the theory of wabi-sabi really suit the entire process of the project, where and also suitable with the tea ceremony, where making a matcha, and that is a part of the art of making a tea, is the same as creating this installation, because we don't use it with using machines. We do it everything by hand, and everything have to be manually draw and manually to create that imperfection edges for that paper. And I think that is the end of the slide.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah, for
No
the sharing.
problem.
I think it's a very eyes-opening to look into how like you apply the strategies in design into your project, which I think and the amount of effort that you put into your installations, like humongous, and like you have to do it one by one. I think that's the the most tedious things that we I mean have to go through. I mean, well, I think from my observation, I mean, when I'm teaching design, is that the students like they are very eager or very excited to like come up with the narrative and the design itself, and how from the concept come up with the forms, and then how they apply into a design. It's very fantastic, but they are lacking part of the theory, which is like, which I believe the theory part is really important somehow to become like a guideline or guidance for the students to come up with the more realistic or more more significance of the outcome. Then I think it is part which is very crucial for the students to look at. Well, definitely, not everyone's are really into reading and stuff like that, So I think it is really important that what make the study times more thriller lah. Like when you go outside and you practice, like it's different kind of like scenes, like you don't have much time to study and to look into the theoretical part, where this is the time when you try to adapt the theory and also the concept of the design lah. It's well, if any of the students or any of the audience wanted to ask questions to the speaker, please post it. Well, we have a question here from Kelson. How to draw accurately random paper designs needed to design outcome?
I have to be honest. I have to be honest that it's not accurate. So I mean, of course, it's in the digital modeling. It just I think it's more on a template that we can follow. But when translate that into a manual hand drawn, everything would be how to say this. It's quite it's a natural thing that you have to see on your by your own eyes, and you have to imagine, like, because it is such a big piece and we have a quite very small spaces to work with. So what we have to do is to measure the length and the width from the computer and mark it in that paper, and that all that flowy kind of movement is actually quite it's not as accurate as the paper, but we just follow the dimensions that we have put it in our SketchUp. Yeah. Yeah. I
Yes.
mean, I think in design process, sometimes you don't have to be accurate. Sometimes that surprise elements actually can surprise you with quite an interesting outcome. So it's the same thing as in interior design project. Sometimes when you create your project, and you think that the entire design looks a bit dull and so on, but actually I think don't stop. We just have to continue and experiment it with different materials or different techniques or texture. Then that will create some different to your project. Yeah.
Another questions we have here. Any maintenance required for the paper material, or is it going to be in a durable conditions forever?
For now, we actually mentioned this to our client that paper is quite a fragile materials, and it's hard for you to maintain it for quite a long time. And using a watercolor paper actually, in times it will become quite a yellow, because of the lights and everything. But that is the risk, or that is part of the thing that the client wants. He wants to see. I think the maintenance wise is he just put aside the maintenance wise because he wants to have that kind of the aesthetic appearance in his store. Other than that, I think since the installation is quite far from natural sunlight, so I think it will take time to for that people to be bendy or to be rosak lah. Yeah.
All right. We have another question. Just now you mentioned research apply into the narrative poster. Do we need to come up with the narrative poster that relevant to the interior architecture, or as long as the objective and the ideas could reflect the concept?
Can you repeat that question again?
Okay, so just now you mentioned research apply into the narrative poster. Do we need to come up with the narrative poster that relevant to interior architecture, or as long as the objective and the idea could reflect the concept? Is it specific to the interior architecture elements, or it can be?
I'm not sure what you meant by related to interior architecture project. I think what should be.
I think the elements of the interior architecture.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, having a theory or research during the first stage of your project, you don't have to limit yourself yet with other interior architecture elements, because if you limit all this concept and everything, then you're not going anywhere. You just stagnant in that process. So I think the interior elements will come later when you have finalized your intention of your project. For example, like I said, there are 3 things that you should tackle in creating your interior design project, and that is theory, realism, and reasoning. So having a theory, technically, I think is more on based on your perspective, but based on your opinions. But of course, that need to support with research, facts, and figures, so that it doesn't like short sneery, right? And then throughout the process, when you have your concept and you want to apply that into a 3-dimensional space, that's when the interior elements come in. You have to make it functional. How to make this fantasy become functional? How to make your dream to become physically there and give some function to the user. So I think try not to limit yourself first during the first stage in your concept, because later on all that will come in, because that is part of the interior design project. People will ask the technicality and the practical part in your project. Yeah, I hope that can answer your questions.
Yeah, I think we can relate that with the project that you shared with us earlier from the Bartlett, where the subject matter is actually from the fabric print. Like the stories is behind that, and then how it's applied into the design concept. It's very fascinating. Well, we have another questions. Your favorite references, books, personality design or non-design that inspired and influenced your work?
Okay. One of it is films and movies, obviously, because I mentioned in the lecture. Because I think watching movies is actually quite interesting because they need to put a narrative that is something very uncommon. Things that you're not yang you tak predict, right? So I think science fiction movies can be a good reference in your design to let you think critically. Other than that, in terms of books, I would suggest this is suggested by our friend No to Scale, which speculative everything. That is one of the book I think is quite interesting, where it's speculate a lot of things. And then books, personality, design and non-design that inspire influence at work. Okay. Other than that is by traveling. I mean, when I say traveling is doesn't mean out of Malaysia, traveling on your own house or at your own village or something can actually give inspiration to you. And looking at some imperfection things, would be quite interesting as well, because I think before this we have this perception that interior design is more about luxurious things, but I think throughout time I think people can understand and appreciate that we can also use things that is like waste or things that is abandoned to be part of the design. So I think it's all about creativity on how you take things that is maybe not valuable anymore, things that is obsolete, to be part of your design and bring back the value of that materials, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, so I hope that we answer Fakul's questions just now. Yeah, so well, I think I would like to ask like for a tips lah. Well, when we look into like there's a lot of reference that we can get whenever that we wanted to design, especially when we do our research for the theory part, where there's a lot of reference and how actually you pick the one that most relevance to your projects or do you have any tips on that?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, in my own practice, I think that is the most critical part in the design process. You cannot get, the entire idea or the entire narrative at one time. There's a lot of process that you need to go through. One tip that I would suggest is to always ask other people's opinion, whether your theory or your a perception about certain things are logic to other people. And I think that is why some of the process in interior design or architecture project is to have a crit session or tutorial with your lecturers. So don't miss any of the crit session or any of the tutorial session, because that will create to strengthen whatever things that have in your mind. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yep, yep. Well, anyone else got a questions? As happy to write letter. Okay. All right. So, well, any more questions from the floor?
Well, I would like to add some things, Mr. Hafiz,
Yeah. Sure.
regarding tips just now. Sometimes, from my experience, sometimes when you want to come up with a new design, you need to have an input. You need to have an input before you can come up with an output. So having an input can come from your research based on the site context. I mean, in interior design project, you cannot disregard the people's opinion or the people's practice and culture in certain area. For example, if you went to Malacca, you have to respect and be sensitive towards their practice and their beliefs. So sometimes that practice or their beliefs could become the concept for your project. So I think the idea, what I'm trying to say is, to have an idea is to go deeper into, some issues or some certain things or subject matter. It doesn't matter whether it come from mana-mana kan, like having an interview with the people who live in that site could give an idea towards what to your intention of your project. Yeah.
True. I totally agree with that. Like sometimes when we are too eager to change the certain place, like they have their own characters and identity. That's where the mapping is really important to understand more about the context of this site, and then only your research will, like get inspired from there and get reference from the mapping. I think that should be the directions of like when we do a design, not like we are randomly inspired from very very out of nowhere, like very aliens design to a place that not significant to that. So yeah. Any more questions?
Not boring.
Surely not. I believe we get a lot of informations and knowledge from your sharing sections. I think it's very crucial because this is the important parts, to generate a good designer. We are not only looking into the commercial designers, to produce that, but also like more, knowledgeable in research aspect and whatnot. So it is very important. Yeah. So, well, yeah, a lot of questions. Okay. So, okay. I think they like the Neko Neko project. It's more like Instagrammables space. Yeah, yeah.
You should visit Neko Neko. I think they have two stores at this moment, if I'm not mistaken. One in KL. I think it's near the Chinatown. That one is designed by Unit 1, if I'm not mistaken. So that is quite an interesting project as well. And the one that I and Studio Weekend did was actually Niko Niko Macha in Bangsa in Jalan Makruf. So if you like to visit, please go. But it's quite a small space, so sometimes it can be very crowded and compact sometimes. Yeah.
All right. Well, there is any questions? If not, I'm going to take group photos. I hope that everyone can switch on your camera for a while for a record before we end. Can we get everyone? Right. There's 3 pages that I have to go through. So bear with me. Okay. All right, page 1 done. 1, 2, smile. Okay. All right, the next page. Done. Okay, are you guys ready? 1, 2, 3. I think the last page. Done. Okay. All right, done. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your time and your sharing. Yeah, so I believe that students are very happy with the sharings today. So I hope that can keep in touch again in future and see you face to face. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.